I don't expect people to believe me, but I know what I saw. It was about 2 o'clock at night. I was sitting at my desk and I looked up because I saw a person walk across the range into the shower area, which is impossible because I was the only officer in there and all the inmates were locked down. Freaked me out, so I got up to make a round. There was a Native American inmate in the cell directly adjacent to the shower that saw it also. He asked me if I just saw what he saw. I told him yes, and we both kind of chuckled. The ghost, or whatever you want to call it, is that of a Native American that had hung himself in that housing unit decades earlier. He tends to appear to other natives when they are in the unit. Separate incident, but same ghost also appeared to another young Native inmate who told me how this Native dude was sitting on the end of his bed one night just looking at him. I had never told this inmate about the ghost. This probably isn't my best story, but it's my favorite. Inmate hadn't showered in weeks. She smelled terrible. She was in secured housing, so her bunkie had been making complaints. After a certain amount of time, lack of hygiene is a disciplinary violation. She goes to confinement for a forced shower. I'm fairly new in the department at this time, so of course I get the grunt work. I have to go to her locker, retrieve her property, and inventory it for storage. She refuses to give us the lock combination, so we have to use the bolt cutters. Finally get it open and it's filthy. She has a bag of wet dirty clothes. I double glove up at this point. The clothes are mildewed. I take the bag of clothes out and find used maxi pads all over her property. At the time I was in complete shock, but I couldn't show it. There were roaches coming out of the locker as I pulled more stuff out. Just filthy. I finally get to her paperwork. I was sure that the worst was behind me. Nope. The first folder is full of demonic horned figures. Pages and pages of them. Real grisly pictures. Decapitations, torture, and tons of blood. I thought that these figures were just scribbled in for color, but after I looked closely, it was officers' names written hundreds of times within these characters. Each character was an officer. Each dead figure was a staff member that was no longer there. I've had inmates threaten to kill me, inmates tell me my address, my license plate number, and where I'm from. Still to this day, that creepy old woman is the creepiest thing I've ever dealt with. The one thing that has truly stuck with me is the one suicide I found during my 3 a.m. count. On midnight shift you count the inmates at 12, 3, and 5 o'clock at the night. I worked in a high-rise prison in a downtown major city in the US, and each floor had 2 units which were the mirror images of one another. There was one CO, correctional officer, per unit, and we would count each other's unit. So at the 3 at night count everyone was accounted for at the previous 12 at night count, so you end up counting pretty quickly for the 3 and 5 in the morning counts. There are normally 2 inmates to a cell, so you just shine your flashlight through the window of the cell and count the lumps in the bed. I get to just the 4th or 5th window and I notice one guy was not in bed and looked like he was praying, which isn't complete crazy. Muslim inmates have to pray at weird times. So I move on to the next window, and as I am counting 2 more I think, wait, something was up with that praying guy. I really don't know what made me think that, and I go back to the previous cell window and flash my light, and there is this lifeless body hanging ever so slightly from a string tied to the top bunk. He had no blood in his face and his body was completely limp, so I knew he was dead. I hit my body alarm and had control call EMS. I woke up his cellmate who was in the top bunk and removed him from the cell. Here is the amazing part. The inmate used the string that was in his laundry bag to hang himself. He didn't even remove the string from the bag. He tied it through a quarter-size hole in the metal top bunk. The bunk is only 5 feet 5 inches tall, so picture, the inmate puts the rope around his neck, but he was taller than the bunk. So he had to get in the kneeling position to begin to cut off the circulation. The thought that always sticks with me is that all he had to do is stand up to stop the process. His hands nor his feet were tied. He had such a desire to die that he just stayed in that kneeling position until he passed out and eventually asphyxiated. Note, he was only in prison for about 2 weeks and was busted for molesting many kids for many years. Worked as a deputy sheriff at Twin Towers Correctional Facility in downtown Los Angeles. Famous for housing mentally ill inmates that are arrested within Los Angeles County. To say I am jaded to bizarre activities is an understatement. I once forgot that a man had removed his own testicles that day when my wife asked, "How was work?" Many years ago when I was on training and working a floor that houses the cream of the crop crazies, a guy tried to commit suicide. Semi-normal occurrence, but odd method of execution. First he covered himself in his own diarrhea, so he would be harder to grasp and fight with. Then he packed his mouth full of his own poop and started to swallow it to try to clog his throat. Finally, he had found a small plastic bag, his cell was supposed to be empty. No idea how he got it, and pulled it over his head and started to choke himself out. It was working. Eventually, we had to enter his cell to save him. I ruined my uniform that day. The creepy part is this. Now, I don't think I have to explain to you how severely disturbed this kid was. He was unhinged. 1,000-yard stare. Just crazy. After his attempt on his life, he wasn't talking. After we revived him, no CPR, thank God, we took the bag off and he coughed everything up. He was heavily restrained and looking around at everyone with a blank stare and half grin, like. I can't really convey how creepy it was, but you get my point. He wouldn't respond to any of our questions, didn't cry, didn't say anything. I finally asked, in a last-ditch effort, "Where did you get the bag?" And I'll never forget the way his head snapped over to stare at me, and with that same shit-eating grin still on his face, I had to. He looked right at me and said, "Why?" The devil gave it to me, of course, and that was the only thing he said. I was working a housing unit alone one night in a county jail. I was in the control booth when I received an intercom buzz from an inmate. All he said was, "You might want to come up here and see what's going on next door." I walked into the housing pod, which was dark, and could hear a faint scream coming from a cell. I told my deputy assistant to open the door and an inmate walked out of his cell from the second floor, dripping, covered in blood, completely naked holding something in each hand. Blood was dripping from the second floor tier onto the first floor. I noticed the blood was coming from his groin area and the object he had in one hand was covered in blood, which later we found out were his testicles. He threatened to eat them, as well, but we didn't know what he was referring to. I had nightmares for weeks.